Okay, welcome back to Confabulous 2021, everyone, for our second panel of the day. My name's John Till, and I'm here with author Catherine Lundoff, and we're going to be talking this morning about gaming and media tie-ins with gaming. Catherine has been doing a lot of writing for Onyx Path games, role-playing games, and she was excited to talk about that work, and I was excited to have a conversation with her about it because I am a fan of Vampire, the Masquerade, and Mage, and Wraith, and Werewolf, and so on and so forth. So she's going to be talking about her work with that, as well as maybe some games you haven't heard of. So Catherine, welcome.
Hi there. Thanks so much for having me.
So I've known you for years as a local Twin Cities author, someone who comes to conventions. Do you want to talk for a minute about kind of your other work, and then we can dive into gaming fiction? Just give people a sense of what you write.
Sure. I've been around for a number of years. I've written a lot of fiction. About 5 years ago, I started up my own small publishing company. So I run Queen of Swords Press, and it publishes some of my work as well as that of other authors. I also do some editing. I edited the ghost story collection, Haunted Hearts and Sapphic Shades, lesbian ghost stories, among other things. I write horror, fantasy, romance, mystery. I have a sideline in writing Sherlockiana. And in the last few years, I've also gotten pulled into doing some media tie-in related work, which has been kind of new for me. So that's been about the last 3 or 4 years. And one of the reasons I was really excited to be on this panel is that a couple of weeks ago, Onyx Path released the RPG for Ghost Hunters, which is another World of Darkness property. It's kind of being billed like an offshoot of Wraith, which I also did a bit of writing for. And I've written for the tie-in anthologies that went up on Kickstarter for the Cainite Conspiracies, which is for Vampire the Masquerade, the 20th Anniversary Edition, and Haunting Shadows, which was the Wraith 20th Anniversary Edition. And so when I was asked to write something for Ghost Hunters, I was like, okay, great. It'll be in one of those funky little anthologies that comes along with the Kickstarter. Terrific. Great opportunity. Get to learn some new stuff, to explore the games. And what ended up happening is there were some delays and wacky hijinks. Stuff happened, which honestly encompasses everything for the last couple of years. And it just came out this year. I think it was originally slated to maybe be last year, and it didn't work out. But it just came out a couple of months, 2 months ago now. And it's available at DriveThru RPG. And one of the fun things about it was, between one thing and another, we hadn't really talked about this, so I didn't know until the rulebook showed up. But my story became a scenario for the game. So it's part of the setup to show you how you can set up a story and use it as a jumping off point. And I'm just really excited about that because I've never gotten to do that before. And so, it's an exciting new opportunity for me. It's an exciting opportunity to, encourage people to explore the game and check it out. And all of my writing to date has been through Onyx Path, I should say, which is a gaming publisher based in Madison.
So one of your short stories is in the Ghost Hunters core rulebook.
Yes.
And then they do a breakdown of like how a GM would run this kind of a story.
Well, the rulebooks, from what I've seen, and bear in mind that when I wrote for Vampire, it was the first time I'd done this. And I know that people are very, very passionate about World of Darkness. Mm-hmm. And to be perfectly honest, I've never actually played it as a player. So what I did with Vampire was I read the entire rulebook cover to cover, so I would get it right. It's about, 350, 400 pages worth of stuff. Ghost Hunters, the rulebook, there's a whole bunch of things in it So it's not like there's a breakdown of, this is how you're setting up your game. It's here's possibilities. So here's some historical information about historical mediums and seances and spiritualists. Here's some different kinds of scenarios. Here's our breakdown of the rules for this particular game. But you can incorporate this into how you're setting up that game, that scenario, those players.
Cool. Well, I think gaming fiction started as a fairly pedagogical enterprise. At some point, somebody decided, well, one way to give people a feel for the rules and the story, the setting and the possibilities is to, give them some fiction that gives a flavor. And for me, so I'm probably your worst nightmare as an interviewer. Those are pieces that I generally skip over because I want to get to the rules. So when you're writing those pieces, and I think some people really like them, and some people really kind of dislike and want to move on to the rules as quickly as possible. But when you're writing for the game, what are you most trying to do? And feel free to also say if Onyx Path has given you any direction about what they want to see in gaming fiction. That'd be really interesting to hear too. So talk to me about, so figure I'm kind of the worst reader of gaming fiction, which doesn't mean that I never do read it, but it's a really common thing in RPGs these days, and RPGs lead to stories. If you don't get a story out of an RPG, something bad has happened, right? So how do you think about that, or how do you kind of think about writing fiction that relates to a game? What's your process? You said you read the core rule book, which in the case of Vampire 20th Anniversary Edition is huge. It's a lot.
It's a lot.
So, I mean, maybe to start with, what was it like to read that huge book?
Okay, so I'm going to backtrack a little bit.
Sure.
So when I started writing fiction, I didn't start writing fiction until I was in my 30s. And one of the things that I got pulled into early on, there was a big market for literary erotica back in the late 90s through the mid 2000s. And I got into that market. And the reason this is relevant, I also did some writing for newspapers. The reason that this is relevant is that, a lot of people come into fiction writing, they start when they're very young, they do a lot of fan fiction, they follow a different path. I got dropped in my 30s to things that were, I had invites to anthologies. Things were often fairly structured and on very tight deadlines. Now, the advantage to learning to write like that is that I can sit down still to this day and crank out 20,000 words given X parameters. None of these stories that I've written are 20,000 words. Just for the record, they're all around 5,000. But it was really good practice. So when the literary erotica market went poof, along about late 2000s, I shifted into writing more horror. And I did BarCon at a convention and met one of the editors from Onyx Path, and we got to chatting. And in the course of the conversation, she's like, "Oh yeah, give me your card." I was like, "Sure." I hand these out, all of these things. And so I did that. And we stayed in touch, and we talked a few more times. And when they were looking for writers to write for Vampire, I got an invite. And so I was nervous about it because even though I haven't played Vampire. I've played D&D, I've played other games, but I haven't played, anything in the World of Darkness series. But I used to hang out with, people who were friends with the vampire prince of the city, and people who were playing Vampire since they were like 13 onward, and it was their gateway to all gaming, all fandom, everything. So I understood that there was this really big cultural fanish connection there. So my first concern was to get it right. Now, one of the interesting things that about gaming writing, and I think this is true fairly universally for at least the short stuff, novel length media tie-ins are kind of their own bucket. I haven't done that yet, but I have friends who do. But for the shorter things, you're actually sending them your first draft. And this is how Onyx Path works. So you send them your absolute first draft. You do your pitches, they pick the pitches they like, you send them the first draft of a story, and they respond to that. Now, if you're coming from a background fiction writing, this is just like, nobody gets to see my first draft. So that was emotionally difficult, but I got over it. So, I spent enough time with the rulebook that I could come up with pitches, of things that would interest me. And so for the Cainite Conspiracies, which is vampires set in the Middle Ages, essentially. It's more complicated than that, but that's the short version. I was looking at possibilities. So I was given a specific year and, some, basic setup and the rule book. So what I did was I looked at historical events in Northern Europe during that time period. And one of the things that happened, I believe the year was 1260 or 1266, I'd have to double check. One of the things that happened that year was King Henry II in England exiled the entire Jewish community in England. Everybody who refused to convert was exiled. So I used that as a jumping off point. And the way I usually describe how the pitches worked was I started out with a pitch that I could write fairly easily and felt pretty confident about. The second pitch was something that would involve a little more work on my part, but I was still pretty confident about it. And then there was this pitch that was related to the Jewish community being, sent into exile, going to the free cities along the Baltic and running afoul of vampires. And I looked at that one and I was like, oh, that'll be a lot of research. I'm less super confident about that one. So, of course, naturally, in the way of such things, the editors went, ooh, interesting, do that. So I had a couple of things I was trying to get right. So I did, I was doing some research about what is available. It's not a ton, but there is some, about Jewish communities and what happened when they were kicked out of England. I did, research on, a few things around that, and I read the entire vampire book. Came up with a story. We went through multiple drafts of it. Things came back the first time. They're like, this is a really interesting idea, but it has no relevance to the actual game. Could you fix that? So there were things I definitely had to, rework and fix, and, sent it back again. And I think it took 3 or 4 drafts to get to the final version that appeared. And so, it went out into the world, and I was, sort of eagerly watching things to see what would happen. And that particular version of Vampire, which again, 20th anniversary, Onyx Path, not the intervening version, which had problems and issues, went over really well. It won at least one award that I'm aware of for tabletop gaming and some other sundry things. So that was really lovely. And the next year, Onyx Path came back again and said, hey, we're doing 20th anniversary, edition of Wraith. Would you like to try that? And I found Wraith more emotionally challenging to, as somebody who's like reading the rule book to get through this. And, Wraith to me is kind of like, wait, you can gaslight yourself? Why are you doing that? Still read the manual, still wowed by the world building, but it was a little more challenging to come up with something that would mesh with that. And so again, I sent off my pitches, and they came back and said, actually, we'd really like you to do a sequel with these characters that were in the Cainite Conspiracies. I'm like, okay, so you would like me to do a story about 13th century Jewish vampires in Wraith? Okay. So I managed to come up with something that worked for everybody, which basically has one of the characters from my Cainite Conspiracy being forced to visit the underworld, looking for someone. So I worked that in, and she runs across from, former family members, and stuff happens. So that came out a couple of years ago. The process for Ghost Hunters was different in that I didn't have the rule book, which I got to say was just like, it was like working without a net. I'm like, but I don't know anything about Ghost Hunters.
So does that game relate to the Orpheus Project series of games, or is it's a completely separate kind of thing?
I think it's a completely separate kind of thing.
Okay.
Because when I went looking for stuff, because I was going out, I was looking at user forums, I was looking at, where fan fiction was and chat rooms and that kind of stuff. There wasn't that much out there. So I think it was a complete spin-off project while things were going through their other iteration before they went back to Onyx Path. I follow some of that out on Twitter, but I'm not necessarily up to date on the gory details about what happened. I just know that, the current owner of White Wolf pulled Vampire, put it with another company. Not great things happened. They pulled it back. They gave it back to Onyx Path. So that's my understanding of the trajectory, And so, so I think Ghost Hunters was a completely, separate spin-off project that, obviously it's been around for 20 years because you're doing a 20th anniversary of it. I didn't necessarily see it as an automatic tie-in with Wraith, but in marketing, it is definitely getting tied in with Wraith.
Okay.
So if you like Wraith and you're into Wraith, that might be a good place to start. But there's enough in here looking at the, how the rulebook is structured that if you were interested in ghost hunting, how World of Darkness handles the afterlife, how they handle, people going back and forth and the world building that goes into that, I think you definitely, want to take a look at this game.
So who is a ghost hunter? Is that a mortal, or is that
They're generally mortals, yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Well, cool. So to me, as somebody who played the original White Wolf games, that sounds like its own thing, but tied into Wraith. So where does your fiction appear? It's in the core book, and are there also spin-off anthologies that have fiction that you've written for Ghost Hunters yet, or is it all in the core book?
I don't know if they're doing a spin-off of this. I think they are.
Okay.
Because there were a number of us who wrote for it. My story is like right after the introduction in the core book. Which was just like, a moment. That one actually has kind of an interesting story because my story for Ghost Hunters is it's set in contemporary universe. It's set in the US. And, I sent out my pitches, did the whole thing, got my pitches back. And so I wrote the first draft of the story, and my editor sent it back with a polite note that said, yeah, no. I'm like, well, you didn't give me the rules. I'm not sure how this works. I'm just guessing. I'm extrapolating from what's out there. And it just, it didn't work for them. So I retooled it, sent it back in, and they liked that one better. But, I went through a couple of versions of that before I got to a version everybody was happy with. And that's what's in the rule book. But considering we started out at the no point, which, for regular fiction submissions, that would have been it. We would have been done chatting about that particular story and life would have gone on. But it's nice that within, at least this particular segment of writing for tie-ins, that you get the opportunity to fix it, to retool something, to rework it, and to get it into a place that will work for your editor, the fans, the people, reading this. Reception at Ghost Hunters looks like it's really good so far. Seen a lot of glowing reviews. Cool. So seems to be,
that's exciting,
on its way to becoming a hit.
That's exciting. And, I would think that if I'm producing RPGs and somebody has invested days in reading my core books, right, and they have the skills to write fiction, you can't just say no, thank you, because those people are rarities. And you know, even the story example you were sharing about the expulsion of Jews from England under Henry II, was it Henry II?
It's Henry II.
And then, you know, these communities move to the Baltics and encounter vampires. That must have involved a lot of research. But again, you know, I think I first met you, well, I've known you through Diversicons, and I think you were on the steampunk panel that I put together at a Galaxicon several years ago. Maybe not, but I know you know Victoriana pretty well too.
Victoriana is my friend. Yeah.
There. So what are you working on now?
What am I working on now? I just put out, I had a new novel come out in March, and that's part of my menopausal werewolf series. So it's kind of horror adjacent. And so let's see, what else have I done this year? I sent in a new, I wrote a story that appeared in Sherlock Holmes and the Occult Detectives, the first set last year. And I've set in a new one for this year's edition. So I'm waiting to find out about that. I'm working on a new fantasy novel, and I've sent out a couple of things that are, you know, Gothic horror related, and waiting to hear back about some of those. Apart from that, you know, as a publisher, I just published 2 more books this year. So we're doing a lot of stuff around that.
So Jason was wondering, if you're not familiar with the White Wolf games and setting, would it be difficult to follow your stories that are written for White Wolf and Onyx
I'm
Path?
familiar with them. Familiarity is not missing. I just haven't played them, which isn't the same thing. So I'm coming at it from a different perspective.
Right.
Everything has passed through multiple editors at Onyx Path and fans at this point. So I'm going to say that no, it is not at all difficult, and apparently my stories seem to mesh pretty well with the universe.
But if you don't know the universe, how about that?
If you absolutely are unfamiliar with it, I don't know. I mean, I think, you know, they would stand alone as vampire stories or as, you know, ghost hunter stories, because that's, you know, I wrote them with the framework in mind, but it's not so intensely, you know, dropping of different names of different classes of vampires that it's dependent on you having, you know, great familiarity with how the 20th anniversary edition was structured.
So I have to ask this question. So since you write your own series of novels about menopausal werewolves.
Yes, yes, I do.
have you toyed with the idea of writing for werewolf, or is that something you want to stay the hell away from?
Like, I would love to get asked to write for werewolf. I would be delighted to get asked. Hasn't happened yet, but, you know, hope springs eternal, and there's always new projects. So, you know, yeah, I would absolutely love to write for a werewolf related game. That would be a lot of fun. You know, either, you know, the White Wolf Onyx Path version, or, you know, anything werewolf related. Always happy to do werewolves. But yeah, so far that opportunity has not yet arisen. So we'll see.
So you've been writing short stories, I think, right? And is the Cainite Conspiracy a short story collection, or is that a short story that's set in the vampire?
Cainite Conspiracies is an anthology. So there's multiple authors in there. For folks who are into a lot of the writers who have participated in World of Darkness over the years. Let's see. So Maurice Broaddus has a story in it.
That's cool.
There's somebody else. Nope, they're in Wraith. So there's a couple of other names that I recognize. So if people are interested in gaming fiction, there's a nice broad selection in here. And in Haunting Shadows, it includes a story by Jackie Casada.
Okay.
Who was one of, has been around for a long, long time, has written for a whole bunch of games. So I think a lot of people recognize her name. And, since you're here at Confabulous, also, I believe a lesbian, but certainly in a long-term relationship with another woman who passed on last year, I think.
Okay.
Because I remember seeing the fundraisers. But yeah, so if you're a fan of some of Jackie Casada's other work, there are other. While my stories are not in these anthologies, are not explicitly queer, they're coded queer, and there are other queer writers involved in this. And for the purpose of Ghost Hunters, one of the main writers on it, Michelle Ballinger, is also queer, and so you can expect a level of inclusion, and that'll be part of the world building, and that it's something that might be of interest to you if you're a queer gamer and looking for more things to check out that may not be explicitly queer but are at least affirming.
I think Vampire was, other than Tecumel, where there's a few sentences of setting description from the late 70s or early 80s that say that this world is LGBT inclusive, not in that language, but that was mainly the point. Vampire was probably the queerest game that I encountered in the early 90s. So it totally makes sense that Onyx Path would be kind of continuing that tradition. Have you written any LGBT characters for any of the Onyx Path stories that you've written?
Not yet. The two characters in Canine Conspiracies can be read as, women who are likely to end up together.
Okay.
It's hard to completely de-queer my work. You can, but it takes a little bit of effort. But they're not explicitly queer, because that wasn't something that I was asked. One of my pitches was for an explicitly queer story, and they were more interested in this one. So
how is writing horror for yourself, for your own creations that aren't tied to a game, different from writing it for something like Vampire the Masquerade? Are there certain things that they wanted you to stay away from or move towards, or are there certain ways that you think, I'm saving this for my own line of fiction, or like this is too kinky, or this is too gross, or my editor is telling me to be more gross? Like, I'm just wondering how it's different.
Writing for something like, with established rules and an established world, it means you've already got a framework. The stuff that I write for myself, that's things from the back of Catherine's brain. Mm-hmm. And I'm a pantser, so I tend to get, I get inspired, I get a, vision for how things are going to work, and I build forward from there as a writer. For these, they're a lot more planful. I have to do the pitching. I have to come up with, essentially a very high level outline before I can do anything. And then I have to tie it in with something that's going to be relatable to the people playing that game. Whereas with my own fiction, it's, the werewolves are a fairly easy example, because this is the second novel that just came out. And for the first novel, what happened which kind of surprised me, because when you start out writing, all writing is in your head, so you might imagine an audience, but you don't really know how they're going to react. Mm-hmm. And so when I put out, the first book, which was Silver Moon, people would come to me and ask questions like, can I go there? Are these characters based on someone real? And my favorite reaction, which was just like absolutely overwhelming, when the times it's happened, the people who would come and tell me it was their coming out novel, which was just like, oh, never even occurred to me, not even a blip on my horizon that would ever happen. So that was kind of amazing. And book 2 is, I wanted to go back and revisit those characters, follow up on what happened to them next. So there are rules, but they're my rules. And so they take on a different flavor. They take on a different, I think about them differently. So like the characters from my werewolf pack kind of live in my head. They're all kind of hanging out there doing their thing. And every now and then one of them pops up and goes, hey, a story. Whereas the writing that I've done for gaming is much more akin to either getting asked to write for specific kinds of anthologies, or certain kinds of journalism. I've written for a lot of indie newspapers and small magazines and things like that. And it tends to be very much, okay, we want 500 words. It needs to cover X, Y, and Z, touch on the following, or interview such and such, so it's very, boxed specific in that sense. Mm-hmm. It's cool to do that kind of writing too, just because you learn some skills doing that are often useful for your own work, later. Like I can sit down and of an evening, despite being tired, despite being distracted, I can crank out X number of words because I have a deadline in my head and I know roughly what needs to happen here. I may not like those words 2 days later. I may change them drastically, but I can draft that, and it's a way, especially for those of us who are more inspiration driven, to be able to put a framework on your writing and say, okay, I want to deliver X, whatever X happens to be. So here's how I get there. And if I have to get there, with 500 words or a page a day, then we're going to get there with 500 words or a page a day.
So if you could write something if you could write a novel set in sort of the world of darkness, what do you think you'd want to do?
Oh, wow.
Is that a desire?
I would definitely be open to it. There are a few of the character classes that I thought were really, really intriguing, particularly in Vampire, but even reading, my way through Wraith, there's a class of archivists. And the notion of playing around with archivists of the dead, who are actually also dead, was like, there were some interesting possibilities there. So that was definitely appealing. Looking at ghost hunters, if somebody were to pop up and say, write something, ghost hunters related, but it doesn't have to be, we're not going to set the rules for you. You can do your own thing. I'm utterly fascinated by the whole world of Victorian era spiritualism, and how some of the things that some of the mediums were involved in. It's really interesting when it transplants from England over to the US, because it's this huge boom after the Civil War, in part because so many families have lost family members. So you have all of these women gravitating to seances, to spiritualism, because they want to contact those people. And as they organize, a lot of them also get, some of them are coming from the abolitionist movement. And then a lot of them move on into women's, enfranchisement, into the various efforts to get women the right to vote. And in the UK, there's a version of that. But, in terms of like the point in time where the Pankhursts are extremely active, for example, they go into World War I, British white women anyway, get the right to vote because they want their support for the war. Essentially, that's the packaged version of it. It's a different trajectory in the US and it takes longer. But there's just so much stuff built into how people thought about the hereafter and ghosts and death and the veil between the worlds and how those things connected. I would love to play with that. That would be really cool. So.
That sounds really neat. And I know that there's sort of a Victorian age vampire setting, which I thought was really well done for the original Werewolf. I think they brought it out as a supplement for 20th Anniversary Edition too, something along those lines. But I always thought that was a really well done supplement. And I'm personally interested in some of the things that follow up with spiritualism, like theosophy.
Mm-hmm.
In particular, in the 1920s, you had 1920s and into the 30s, you have Sandino in Nicaragua, who's a theosophist who's leading this whole armed uprising against, United States imperialism. And at the same time, the really ruthless dictator in Nicaragua or El Salvador is a theosophist too. So there are these spiritual movements that are social movements that had a huge influence on everyday politics. And it's not too difficult to see how vampires might have been pulling some of the strings there, or other kinds of spiritual beings. So I have my own kind of fascination with the 1920s and into the 30s around some of this stuff. So I think I saw a comment come in. And Don was asking, since you do Sherlock stories, do you ever do tie-ins between Conan Doyle and spiritualism?
Not explicitly. I've written for like an anthology of Moriarty stories and a couple of anthologies of Sherlock Holmes stories. Mm-hmm. So far, like the Sherlock Holmes and the Occult Detectives, I introduced a woman who's an Anglo-Indian inquiry agent who mostly handles supernatural issues, and who, in for a variety of circumstances, she and Holmes are thrown together and end up working together on cases. I haven't done spiritualists with Conan Doyle specifically. It's, certainly something I would, I've kind of thought about it. A lot of the stuff that I've been writing that's set in the Sherlock Holmes universe, for lack of a better term, it's for publishers and editors in the UK. Oh. And they tend to be very close to canon. They like canon. They like sequels. They like things that split off, but they want you to be really engaged with the canon as it now stands. So for those, because I do my research, so like the first one of those that I sold was the Moriarty story, and Moriarty and Tangles with Irene Adler. And I reread the entire canon because there were stories I hadn't read or had forgotten. And so now I've been through the canon like one full cycle at least once, and then most of it for subsequent stories, just to get the tone right. Mm-hmm. Because I think that it's fairly easy, especially in the US, especially, a long time after the fact, to pick up on the more, media focused versions of Holmes and Watson. And they're, so many of them are entertaining. I'm a big Elementary fan, for example, but tonally, they're very different from the original stories in many respects. Some of them capture a lot of the spirit, but they don't quite have the same tone for how, Holmes and Watson actually interact, for how he goes about, solving cases. So it was really helpful for grounding in that. So it would be really, really fun to play with spiritualism in that context. So someday, haven't done it yet.
I would imagine that writing Sherlockiana has something in common with writing gaming fiction too, because you've got a lot of established material and you need to have mastery of that.
And a fan base that cares deeply.
And a fan base that cares deeply and will be ruthless in their criticism.
Yes.
So have you had any feedback on from gamers on your World of Darkness fiction so far? Like what do you hear mostly from the publisher?
I've had a couple of friends who've picked up the rulebook on the basis of me talking about it, who'd played Vampire back in the day and were reconnecting with it. And they really liked the fiction. They thought it was a neat tie-in. It was a neat extra element to it. I haven't heard back from anybody who's done Ghost Hunters yet. So kind of eyeing that and waiting to see, because it hasn't been out for that long. So we'll see what comes back from that. But I'm hoping that it resonates with the folks who play those games and that they think that it works well for, helping them set the stage, helping them come up with a way to structure, a game that's fun for them.
So I was just taking a quick peek here about where someone can buy Ghost Hunters RPG.
Drive through RPG.
Okay.
That's because that's where Onyx Path sells, as far as I know, everything. But you can also find, I've seen it out on Amazon and I've seen it a few other places. So.
Okay. So are you thinking about any other kinds of media tie-in fiction that you'd like to write? I know Melissa Scott's done quite a bit with Stargate, right?
Melissa Scott also has a really interesting game at a Choice of Games, which I've been playing off and on. It's set in this fantasy world in which there's an opera that's dominated primarily by lesbian and bi and non-binary women. And it's really interesting. So it's in the Choice of Games romance section. So that one's definitely worth checking out. I was really disappointed the other day when I logged into my iPad and I hadn't had a chance to get back to the game for a while. And apparently I was only like 3 scenes from the end. I was like, oh, all right, well, we'll go back and try another path through it. I did a proposal for Choice of Games a couple of years ago, and they didn't think it was a great fit for their main line, but they do have a sideline where you can, write your own game, use their code, put it up on their platform, they'll market it, it'll be part of that, but it's not part of like the absolute main Choice of Games options. And I'm probably going to go back to that eventually. One of the things that they hadn't, they had said about it was that I had the idea I liked best, as opposed to the idea they liked best, was a setting which was set on a space station and involved a murder mystery, a bunch of queer characters, political plots, potential for interstellar war. And I'm like, okay, I still think this would make a really good game. So one of the things I want to get back to is working on that. And even though they were like, we can't sell mysteries. I'm like, really? That seems unlikely. I think it would be fun to play with and look at options for, releasing that independently, either with them or, somewhere along the lines. And Choice of Games is fun because it's very text-based. So you can, you can imagine what the characters look like and you can populate, various things along the lines. So I've been kind of, poking at that occasionally and playing some of their other games, looking at how people structure things. So that's one of the things that's kind of on my back burner and has been for a bit. I just got a grant from Ladies of Horror Fiction to pick up on a queer horror writing history project that I'd started a couple of years ago. And we'll see. I may end up doing some spillover in which I also pull this game forward and introduce some horror elements to that too.
Wow. Well, that game you're describing sounds like a great setting. I don't know why anyone wouldn't want to play that. I mean, that's
see, that
cool.
was my take on it. I was like, I would play that.
Yeah, and I think there's like, if you think about things like Babylon 5 and Deep Space Nine, like like things set on space stations is, that's a legit genre any way you look at it.
It's its own thing with its own fan base, even, yeah, I mean, and you could say a lot of the stuff that we look at in science fiction that's set in outer space on ships and so forth. I mean, Aliens certainly has mystery elements to it. There are episodes of things like Deep Space Nine and Bab 5 and so forth that also have, elements to them that you can clearly trace back to mystery. And I think that intersection between horror and mystery and fantasy is just fascinating. And I keep, I'm at a place with my writing where that's an area where I keep kind of going back and going, poke, let's see what happens this time, poke.
So did I hear you say a moment ago that you're working on a history of queer horror?
What I started doing, I had a whole series of high-level survey pieces on the history of LGBTQ science fiction and fantasy, with horror as being kind of tangential, but it was included. And it originally ran on SF Signal. There's updated versions of it out on Queer Sci-Fi. It's a 5-part series. I ended it at 2010 because that's the point where there was just so much stuff. It was hard to keep up with. So I took it from like the dawn of time of this is when we have science fiction and fantasy as we recognize it, to 2010. And as a result of doing that, I got asked to write a horror version of that same kind of survey for Queers Destroy Horror, which is something that Nightmare Magazine did a few years back. It was part of the overarching Lightspeed magazine's Queers Destroy Science Fiction, Queers Destroy Fantasy, Queers Destroy Horror. And they spun it off, and there's a version with women, and there's a version with disabled people, there's a version of people with people of color. And so I had delved into it, but it was something I wanted to go back to. And one of the things that I found when I was doing research for that is it's surprisingly difficult to find decent historical surveys of queer science fiction or fantasy or horror. There's a bibliographic book called Uranian Worlds, which is really good, but it ends in 1997 or something. I mean, it's pretty, that's it. There isn't really anything that comes after that. So there's like onesie, twosie articles, which are, my 5 favorite, whatever, that kind of thing. But there's nothing really comprehensive. And what I wanted to do was to take the piece that I wrote for Nightmare and use it as a jumping off point to talk about the ways that a lot of, for example, characters in, Victorian era ghost stories and so forth are often coded queer. You get a lot of queer monsters, and that's still a trend that you see kind of going forward into contemporary work where, you go from a point where it's like what makes the monster a monster is that they're coded queer. Right. And you kind of spill over into things where the things that make a monster queer make them more sympathetic. So thinking about stuff like Jennifer's Body, which is this movie that, I remember when it came out and everybody was like, this is the worst B movie ever. And it's had this big resurgence in cult following in the last couple of years, where it's getting reclaimed by a younger queer audience, by a younger feminist audience, who are reinterpreting it. And, it's now seen as, this amazing piece of work about elements of being queer, about queer attraction, about how that plays out. And that's part of what makes it appealing, which I think is pretty interesting. And it's not the only example of it. It's just one of the things that came to mind. So you've got, you also have a time period where, for a while there, the whole horror market kind of tanked. And if you weren't Clive Barker, if you weren't Stephen King, you weren't selling books. So you were indie publishing, you were going with the small publishers, small specialty publishers. So there was still a big horror readership. There was still a big fandom, but there wasn't that much that was out there on the mainstream.
Right.
And when you're going back and looking at historical elements for things like queer writers, okay, well, what makes a queer writer? Were they out? Were they out during their lifetime? Is there a reliable source that says they were definitely out? Can you trust that? These are all things to consider. And then within that, you've got, okay, I read this character as queer. Does anybody else?
Mm-hmm.
And then added to that, you've got a layer of, as we spend more and more time on the internet, a lot of certain kinds of information are more ephemeral than others. So when you're going back through and you're looking at, say, the 1990s, it's relatively easy to find things like a single review or an award list. But anything that was like, okay, so for the last 5 years, these are trends in queer vampire horror. Not so much, so just going out and looking for things like that, finding resources, finding the kind of thing that would really flesh that out and make it interesting, is one of the things I'm looking forward to having time to delve into.
So we just got in a juicy question from Jason, which is that he was wondering if there are any properties you'd like to write in, but based on ruthless fans. Now I wonder if there are properties you don't want to write in.
I probably would not touch Star Wars with a 10-foot pole. Even if I knew anything about it, I just no, I don't think so. I don't know if I would venture that far outside my wheelhouse. So, I get horror. I get horror writing. I get people who read horror. It makes sense to me. I don't know that I would go for something that was, completely science fiction. Fantasy, I think there's more crossover in terms of readership and in terms of fan expectation. But, a property like Star Wars or Star Trek, for example, essentially anything that's hit television, you get such a broad audience with so many deeply held opinions about stuff, and some of those opinions I look at stuff online and I'm like, I don't even understand that.
Larry is suggesting you should write a Star Wars vampire novel.
Yeah, and then I will retire from having an online life after that. That's when we turn everything over to the assistant and don't read the comments.
And Donna's mentioning bending the landscape horror. Is that?
Yeah.
I guess
there's a couple of anthologies out there, roughly that same time period. They all come out at roughly the same time, or one right after the other. There's a couple of vampire anthologies that are specifically queer vampire anthologies. So there's kind of like a brief sort of, flowering of targeted anthologies. And then there's pretty much not a whole lot after that for a while. And then it, gradually picks back up, but it picks back up in different forms. So.
There, I remember how big a boom there was in the 90s, and there were great fanzines like Necrophile for horror, and then everything just, like you were saying, just sort of disappeared. And I guess there's more opportunities now, and it's good to see that some of the queer coded horror and fantasy that may have been just on the edges of people's awareness, like the vampire novel The Delicate Dependency. There's a publisher called Valancourt Press that is putting queer fiction and horror back in print, and they're often kind of looking for those intersections.
Mhm.
So that's kind of the one publisher I know that's trying to do some of that
Mhm.
in terms of bringing things back and making them visible again.
Yeah. Yeah,
And just
they're
check
doing some
comments.
interesting stuff with that.
Yeah. So any final, we're in the last 5 minutes here. Oh, okay. So any final thoughts on anything?
Go check out some World of Darkness stuff from Onyx Path. You know, support your local horror writers, especially if they're writing queer horror, or they're writers of color doing, horror about characters of color. Because it's been hard to bring a lot of that stuff, kind of back from the brink and getting it more visible. And there's a lot of really good stuff out there right now. So I heartily recommend checking out some of the things that are there. Explore new authors, have fun, game on.
And where, so you are a publisher.
Mm-hmm.
Can you just say a little bit about your press and who you're publishing?
So Queen of Swords Press has been around for 5 years now. We have our official 5th birthday in January. And we've got 13 titles out as of this week. And we're publishing a range of things. So it's primarily, it's science fiction, fantasy, and horror. Most of the titles are by queer authors and or centering queer characters. We just released our first title by an author who does not identify as queer, but does include a queer character in her book. And that's obviously Aliens by Jenny Galaboy, which is funny science fiction. Back in August, we released New Zealand author Rem Wigmore's Fox Hunt, which is this fabulous queer solar punk book. It's a lot of fun. We're looking at book 2 for that one. We've done My Werewolf novels. We've done Alex Axe, who's a trans writer from Colorado, who's written a bunch of really great linked steampunk stories. So we've done a couple of those. We've done a couple of my collections of short fiction. I'm looking at doing another anthology next year. I've got one collection of my horror and dark fantasy out through Queen of Swords. Those of you who follow the book awards, the Lexicon's book awards, Spectrums. Those of you who follow the Spectrums, we're going to be releasing a queer Sleeping Beauty retelling by Heather Rose Jones next year. We're doing I'm starting up a new line of science fiction, fantasy, and horror by authors from the upper Midwest. So Jenny's book is the launch for that. We're looking at some other things for next year and the year after. And then, the possibilities there endless. We're doing so much stuff. So we've got several more books in the pipeline. There'll be more things coming out next year. Please take a look at our newsletter. You can sign up on the website. Mm-hmm. You can buy our books direct from us or at Dreamhaven or Bone Shaker. Majors and Quinn has started carrying our titles. Pretty much anywhere you can get books, you can find our stuff. And we have a nice range, and I think we're going to have a lot more variety in the coming years.
Cool. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Catherine. This was a great discussion. And for folks who are joining us today, you can continue to talk about the panel topics in the Consuite for our Discord channel. So you should have an invite to that. And join us at 1:30. We're going to take a lunch break now. But join us at 1:30. The panel topic is Hot Robin covers. Yes, they are coming out in November, the Hot Robin comic book covers, and Loki. So this is really about queer comics and queer adjacent comic related media. So please join us for that. That should be a really fun discussion with Jason Tucker and Lyda Morehouse. And thank you again, Catherine, for joining us, and we'll see folks at 1:30.
Thank you so much.